bringing his White House counsel to the border with him today as he considers whether to declare this national emergency to pay for a border wall. So joining me now to talk about this is former Attorney General appointed by George W. Bush, Alberto Gonzales. He was also White House counsel under George W. Bush. He's the current dean of Belmont University College of Law and author of the book True Faith and Allegiance. Mr. Gonzales, thanks so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it. Do you believe that President Trump has the legal authority to declare a national emergency in order to get the funding to build his border wall?
You know, I think it's a close question. I think Jeffrey Toobin was absolutely right. The statute's written in a way that gives the president a great deal of discretion here. One of the challenges, of course, is that where you're going to build the wall, a significant portion of the border is privately owned. And so what's the government going to do about that with respect to landowners who do not want a wall on their private property? And I also agree with Jeffrey with respect to even if the president does have the authority, the question is there a plaintiff who has standing? And even if you find a plaintiff who has standing in the courts may very well avoid this controversy by saying this is a political question and we're not going to deal with this. Also, depending on the timing of the litigation, the court said this dispute is not right because they don't want to deal with it, and they hope that the political branches can deal with it on their own. And so there are clearly some obstacles in stopping the president in moving forward with this. But on the other hand, I think there are some questions as to whether or not is this absolutely necessary, and even if it's necessary, is there no other way to deal with this kind of problem? So, you know, it's a close question, but again, there's a broad delegation of authority here to the president.
Well, it's a difference between can and should. You think it's possible he can do it, legally speaking, but should he is a different matter. What is the impact on the institution of the presidency in your mind if the president of the United States just decides to go around Congress?
Well, typically these kinds of disputes, this dance between the executive branch and the legislative branch, are often resolved before you get to a crisis point. But it is true that often these kinds of disputes are resolved in the political arena and not in the courts. And so the question is, who has the political will, the political power to impose their will on the other branch of government? I think if the president moves forward over the objections of Congress, you worry about what damage it does to the relationships between the two branches. It also affects what Congress is going to do with respect to future allocations of power. It's going to affect the way that Congress drafts legislation moving forward, giving the president this broad delegation of authority. And so there could be some adverse consequences that may affect the executive branch going forward.
Now, of course, you spend most of your life in Texas, which is, of course, a border state. You worked in the gubernatorial administration of George W. Bush, who famously said family values don't stop at the Rio Grande River. What do you make of this argument? Do you feel that there is a national emergency, a crisis?
I think the president's position as to whether or not this is necessary to trigger the emergency statute would have more credibility if, in fact, he's moved troops into the region. And I'm talking about armed forces, not National Guard that have been nationalized, but troops, because we have a very serious national security threat. That hasn't happened yet, and that does undercut the president's argument that there is, in fact, an emergency which requires the spending of funds that have not been specifically appropriated for offense. Look, I think for most Americans, they realize we have a challenge on our southern border, but I think many of them would think, well, is it really worse today than it was, say, 2 years ago when the president assumed office? If we had an emergency now, didn't we have an emergency then, and why didn't we take action 2 years ago?
And again, I mean, we have a chart here that proves that point. If you look at the arrests at the southern border here, you look at this, it's at or near an historic low. The last 10 years or so have been right around 300 to 400,000 people right there. Just as a veteran, last question on this subject, as a veteran of the George W. Bush administration and the idea that family values don't stop at the Rio Grande River, how do you assess the rhetoric that we keep on hearing from President Trump on this?
I actually was pleased by the tone and some of the rhetoric that the president displayed the other night from the Oval Office address. But as a general matter, I think Republicans have hurt themselves over the past few years with respect to the tone and some of the rhetoric. Listen, I believe in border security, but we also have to understand that we are a nation of immigrants. We are a compassionate people, and there is a right way and a wrong way to deal with our immigration challenges.
So the former Attorney General of the United States, William Barr, might very well be, probably will be, the next Attorney General of the United States as well. He is someone you know. Do you think he knows what he's getting into? with President Trump in this job?
Well, I was speaking to someone yesterday, and I happened to mention that it's hard to imagine working for two different types of leaders in George H.W. Bush and Donald Trump. They're very different people. Yes, I think Bill Barr is very smart. He obviously has a great deal of experience in working with the Department of Justice, and it will be challenging. That job is challenging enough as it is. There'll be an additional challenge, but I think Bill Barr is talented enough and wise enough. I think he'll do a fine job at the Department of Justice.
Any need for him to recuse himself from oversight of the Mueller investigation, given that he has written at length saying it should be limited or actually being critical of parts of it?
I haven't read what Bill Barr has written. I'm assuming that when he comes into office, he will check with the career ethics officials at the Department of Justice, just to be sure. And if he gets the green light, I don't see any problems whatsoever. If they say there's an issue, then obviously he'll have to make a very difficult decision as to whether or not to ignore that kind of advice.
I will note that Matt Whitaker, the current acting Attorney General, was told there was an issue and that he should recuse, and he didn't. I don't have any reason to believe that Bill Barr acts or behaves in the same way as Matt Whitaker does. Alberto Gonzales, former Attorney General, always a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, John, so our next guests...